I was the Executive Director of Community Legal Education in Ontario, but now I've been helping PLEAC plan this conference. In my role at CLEO, I was fortunate to get involved in some research and conversations about how to better support trained community workers who help people who come to them with law-related problems. And I worked on that research with my colleague, David Weissman from the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, who is here today. And both David and I are continuing to research and think and talk about this topic. So I am so very excited to introduce this panel, Looking Beyond Canada, the role of community workers and other trusted helpers in the justice ecosystem. We have 5 fabulous panelists, all from places outside of Canada. So for the structure of this session, for the first 35 or 40 minutes, each panelist will tell you about the program or research that they're involved in. After that, we will take 20 or 25 minutes for the panelists to engage in a bit of a conversation. For the final 20 minutes or so, we will turn to questions from you, the audience. So I will introduce the panelists now. And the first of our 5 panelists is attending virtually. She lives located in the UK. And that would be Dr. Pilar Domingo. She is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI. She is working on the politics of the rule of law, access to justice, and legal empowerment. Her research focuses on questions of how societies find ways to resolve disputes in nonviolent ways, advance human rights, and hold decision makers and power holders accountable. Pilar is joining us today from England, as I said a moment ago. Charisse Walker, right to my left, is the Director of Programs and Community Services at Westside Justice Services in Chicago, Illinois. She joined the Westside Justice Center in 2015 as a volunteer, bringing her extensive experience as an HR professional and a tax accountant to the job. In her current role as director at Westside Justice Center, Charisse oversees the Legal Services Community Navigator Program. Laura Mendoza, to Charisse's left, is an immigration organizer at the Resurrection Project in Chicago. In this role, Laura leads community navigator engagement that assists in implementing local strategies to improve the lives of immigrants at the local and state level. In the US, Laura is a DACA recipient from Puebla, Mexico. She had some adventures getting across the border yesterday. You can ask her if you're having coffee with her later. Sasha Steinberger, to her left, is the founder and co-executive director of Legal Link in California. Prior to Legal Link, Sasha litigated workers' rights and civil rights cases and clerked for a federal district court judge. Before law school, imagine that, Sasha was involved in community, labor, and electoral organizing and draws on this background to use the law as a tool to help clients move out of poverty. I also note that Sasha did her BA at McGill. Dr. Tara Mulqueen is an associate professor of law at Warwick Law School in Coventry, UK, and serves as co-director of Warwick Law and the Community, the school's program of community-based collaborative projects. She has been involved in designing, teaching, and researching public legal education for the past 10 years. She is currently leading a legal needs study in Coventry with trusted intermediaries, which you'll hear more about in a moment. So we will begin with Pilar from afar. Pilar, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. So Pilar and then the other panelists will be speaking for a few minutes. They'll then engage in a conversation and then we'll take questions from the audience. Okay, over to you, Pilar.
Many thanks. And I think there's a PowerPoint up. Is that right?
Yep, we're all set to go. And just Pilar, let me know when I should advance the slide. So right now, it's just a cover slide with the name of your name and the name of your project.
Okay. So thank you very much. And I should probably clarify that I'm in many respects representing the views or the findings of the working group on customary and informal justice. This is a network of practitioners, non-governmental organizations, international government donors, individuals, researchers that have come together to make the case that if we are to take the lived experience of access to justice seriously, we need to engage not only with access to justice that goes through formal court systems, but with a very broad range of dispute resolution mechanisms and justice mechanisms that, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm calling customary and informal justice, and I'll come back to defining what we mean by that. So the working group came together to advocate the need to engage with the very broad range of dispute resolution and justice mechanisms that feature globally in the world, and with the objective of influencing and informing the international agenda on the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and particularly the Development Goal 16.3, which speaks to improving access to justice and making it equal for all, and making the point that access to justice needs to go beyond that. What international support to access to justice needs to go beyond supporting formal court mechanisms. So this presentation is very much about situating the discussion in the seminar today within the wider and global reality of the fact of pluralism, and how the international agenda is evolving to be much more effective in taking into account the fact that most of the population that engages in dispute resolution will be doing so outside of the formal court systems. So just underlining the fact that the world is made up of pluralist forms of dispute resolution as societies find ways of addressing different justice needs. So, much of what I'm presenting here today is what this report says, which was presented on Monday at the UN Rule of Law Week at the UN in New York. And it aligns very much with the research that I do as well. So for slide 2. So the report underlines the fact that over 5 billion people lack meaningful access to justice. Given that the world population is 8 million people, this really is the majority of anybody seeking some form of dispute resolution or access to justice is unlikely to get a fair deal. Mostly people are denied their rights, and this is especially so for the most marginalized and vulnerable groups, who are, as a result of this lack of access to justice and fairness and access to justice, displaced from land or subjected to violence without remedy and all other kinds of justice harms that can that accompany this fact of lack of meaningful access to justice. And so in order to tackle this global justice gap, the 2030 Agenda committed UN member states to ensure or move towards equal access to justice, articulated in the broad Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is not only about justice, but also about achieving sustainable peace and inclusive societies, with the idea that justice requires other things to be in place in order for access to justice to be fair and equal. And with this, what's evolved is also the concept of people-centered justice, where justice is something that needs to promote the lived experience of people globally, and where the focus is on the lived experience of justice, not on formalized conceptions of what justice might need to involve. And in this sense, while the international agenda has tended to shy away from customary and formal justice, and I'll come back to that in a minute, the fact is that recognizing that formal justice systems may be essential in contemporary societies, and the complexity of contemporary governance mechanisms to ensure justice delivery and some fair standards of what access to justice means from a human rights perspective, we also know that formal justice systems cannot meet the full extent of justice needs of all people. So in reality, the world relies on a very diverse set of justice providers. And so if you could move to slide 3 on definitions. And here we're talking about this very, very broad category of justice dispute resolution mechanisms, which we call customary and informal justice. The term is intended to capture the very, very broad spectrum of providers outside of the state that people seeking justice use to resolve disputes and grievances. This is how this concept was categorized in the report that was launched on Monday. And in practice, here is a number of what this includes, this range of justice providers or decision makers in dispute resolution include chiefs, elders, clan leaders, religious leaders or institutions, paralegals, mediators, indigenous peoples groups, community volunteers, workplace associations, youth associations, local leaders providing dispute resolution services, and other categories. But the point here is that this is, in a plural world, this is a very, very broad category of dispute resolution mechanisms and actors who respond to particular systems and understandings of fairness and justice. It's really important to underline that this world of customary and formal justice is very broad. It's variably formalized. It coexists with variable degrees of complementarity with state systems and formal justice systems as these have evolved in different parts of the world, and different degrees of mutual recognition or mutual antagonism. So there's nothing prescriptive about anything being better or worse, just the fact that this is what the world looks like in terms of the reality of very, very diverse mechanisms of dispute resolution and justice provision. And maybe just to reflect briefly on some of the things that is important to underline as part of this eco-justice system is that, justice, customary and informal justice actors and systems draw on a very broad range of normative foundations that are context-specific and specific to different countries' experience and national and subnational experiences and histories of what constitutes fairness and what are the just and fair ways of resolving disputes. The normative foundations may come from custom, from religious doctrine, from community norms, from indigenous knowledges, or from agreed rules that are constitutionalized, including in recognition of this pluralism. Some common features, more or less, and I'm careful with, it's important to be careful with not categorizing everything as true to all customary and formal justice system, is that there is often a focus on restorative justice, focusing on restoring community relations and community harmony. Often there's a consent-based logic to negotiated solutions, although these may also be coercive and may affirm inequalities that characterize the community. But they are proximate to the community. Whether the community in its entirety feels included and fairly treated is another matter, but they tend to be close to the community in how dispute resolution and justice needs are addressed. The reason why they need to be taken into account is that they constitute the majority of the mechanisms for how the world's population addresses dispute resolution and how the world's population is able to claim their rights outside of formal justice systems. It is also the case that end users rely on customary and formal justice not only because of the absence of state justice, but because there is this proximity in terms of community and cultural common understandings of fairness and justice. They may often be seen as more legitimate and trusted than what are often very flawed court systems in weak democratic or autocratic systems, for instance. And for some societies, indigenous communities, for instance, indigenous justice is simply viewed as the main and primarily legitimate system, where the formal state systems may be perceived more as an imposition resulting from different histories of colonialism and the inequalities that that brings with it. It's also important to underline that the reason that the international community has been very shy of engaging with customary and formal justice systems is that they are seen to be fraught with human rights risks and concerns associated with how women are treated and just discriminatory histories that may feature in different customary and formal justice systems. So these concerns are real, but it's important to underline in how the international community might engage to support rule of law and access to justice and human rights, that human rights abuses are also real in relation to how formal systems operate in many countries in the world, both in terms of the fact that they may be susceptible to capture, they may normatively be based on discriminatory rules or and rules that do not conform to human rights principles. So as with formal justice systems, the human rights concerns need to be taken into account in any exercise by national governments or international development cooperation to engage with customary and informal justice mechanisms. And as with formal systems, customary and informal justice mechanisms are also not fixed in time. They evolve as the result of contestation within communities, contestation that may involve redefining gender norms, redefining understandings of justice, as is true with the normative foundations of court systems in any society or state-driven justice systems. So I don't know how long I've got, and we can return to some of these findings, but I'd like to maybe just echo some of the recommendations, the last slide, but let me know what you think if you'd like me to stop there.
Pilar, yes, maybe just briefly, just one or two recommendations, and then hopefully you'll have a chance to say a bit more about them either in the panel or in the audience questions. Thank you.
So really the key recommendation of the report is to the global community of policymakers and practitioners that want to support improved access to justice that's human rights, that's in keeping with human rights, is that we need to engage with the empirical fact of customary and formal justice in all its breadth, either to change it in support of the most marginalized and excluded groups, or to live with it, to take from customary and formal justice those mechanisms that are most appropriate and culturally relevant and fair for the communities that they serve, including to improve the possibility of improving that justice gap of access to justice. I'll stop there. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Pilar. So interesting. And the report can be found, I think. Did you give the, anyway, we'll make sure people can find the link to your report. Therese.
All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you for having me way from Chicago, Illinois. It's been nice to be here today and the weather here is great. So thank you all so much. There's no snow. I appreciate that. But I've enjoyed myself, and thank you to Julie and Hannah for inviting us. Much appreciated. And so as Julie mentioned, I am Sharice Walker. I am the Director of Community and Program Services at the Westside Justice Center. And so just a little bit about our organization. We are a legal aid organization where we help individuals and families that have been impacted by incarceration. And so in a nutshell, what does that mean? If your community, if you're a person that's been impacted by incarceration, if you're a returning citizen, we help get you reentry services, we help get you IDs, we help walk you through the process of reentering into society. Because the one thing that we know is that when you've been away for any length of time, the world has changed. And so if you went in and you were, say, 22, 23, and you come out at 40, well, at 22, 23, we probably didn't have cell phones, and now we do. Or maybe we had the bag. How many of you all remember when the cars had bag phones? Are you old enough to remember that? Okay. And so life has changed a lot for people. And so we try and walk them through that process. We also try to walk them through getting their records sealed or expunged, and I'll talk just a little bit about that. But we also have a really wonderful community navigator program, which is the real reason I'm here to talk, and what that looks like and how community navigators can help individuals before they get involved with the legal system and can give information prior to meeting with attorneys. And so our mission is we envision a community where systems of justice are created for and by the people, and they're restorative, they're fair, they're equitable. And we do this by amplifying community voices, expertise, and celebrating the culture and knowledge and power of its members. And by that, we take everyday community members. So our community navigators are individuals just like you and I. And so they may not have a background in law. They may not have expertise in what happens in the justice system, but we give them some really awesome training. And most of them are returning citizens. Most of them are individuals that have justice impacted, and they want to figure out, how can I give back to the community? And their way of doing this is to become what we call a community navigator. And so they're everyday individuals, and they are, we usually pay them on a stipend, or some are volunteers, but they help individuals. And how do they help? They help with making sure they're able to provide legal resources. They help in making sure that they're helping to review documents. And so often individuals come back and they don't know how to fill out the forms that they may have when they go to court, or they may not know how to fill out a job application because many years ago, everything was done pen and paper. And now everything is all on the computer. And so we walk people through those services and what that is. Our community navigators are that first point of contact before you have to interact with an attorney. And so some individuals may not even need an attorney. You may really just need someone to show you how to walk through the social services system. And so we train community navigators on the incarceration side to be able to do that, to talk to individuals without doing the unauthorized practice of law, but still able to walk them through the process of trying to re-enter into society and what that looks like. So what do we do for education? We educate individuals on the unauthorized practice of law. We educate them on knowing your rights when you interact with the police, knowing your rights if you should become involved with a landlord-tenant situation and you have to be evicted. What are those rules? What are those laws? What can you do? What can you not do? For criminal record relief, we walk them through the entire process of what it's like to have your record sealed and or expunged, how long it takes, what happens when you go to court. We recently just formed a partnership with the courts in Illinois, where our community navigators are able to go to court with individuals that have an administrative hearing or have a court appointment, and they have to go to court. Well, if you've already been justice involved, you're scared to go into a courtroom. The courtroom is the last place you want to go, and you definitely don't want to go by yourself. And so our community navigators have gone through the process of being trained. What can you do in a courtroom? No, you can't turn on your cell phone. No, you can't loud talk. This is what you can wear. This is what you can't wear. These are the things you can take into a courtroom. And so we walk individuals through that process. And so we have some individuals that say, I'm still terrified to go into a courtroom. I have to go through security. I have to, behave a certain way. I have to do things a certain way. I am fearful of this process. And so we have navigators that are now trained to go into courtrooms and say, I am here with this person, just an observer, to give them some sense of comfort in being in this unfamiliar space, or being in a space that was familiar because you were sentenced by a particular judge, and now you're back in court trying to say, I want to have my record sealed or expunged. And so we have navigators to walk through that process, but we do the education of that first by training the navigators, and they're trained by my organization. And then you hear my counterpart Laura by her organization as well. But we want to make sure that our navigators are equipped to be able to go into the courtrooms. They're equipped to talk with individuals, because oftentimes they don't necessarily need an attorney. They just need help, and they don't know how to get that help. And so people will call and say, I need to speak with an attorney. Well, what's going on? And they tell you what's happening. It's not an attorney they really need. It's really someone that can help them fill out a document. It's someone that can help answer a question that people say, well, only an attorney can answer that. Well, not necessarily. And so our community navigators are trained in such a way that they can do those everyday things with individuals, give individuals that comfort level. Not only that, we all know attorneys, 15 minutes, 30 minutes tops. That's about all of their time they get. Our community navigators, you may need someone for an hour. You may need someone on Monday. You may need them again 2 months from now. And so you're always able to call that community navigator to still form that bond and that relationship, such if you should have another issue arise, then you're able to have that conversation with that navigator to say, help me through this process. I don't know how to do this. The other thing we do is called skill sharing. And that is making sure that we have folks that are compassionate. One of the things we tell people when we hire them is that you have to have a love for people, and you have to have a love to do this work. If you're looking to get rich quick, legal aid organizations are probably not the place you want to work. We are funded by the state, and so there are no big dollars that come from large, private funded corporations. But if you have a passion and you have a true desire to learn this skill set, then there are individuals that you can impact. Because I can tell people, I've never been incarcerated, but you have. And so your story is going to be very different. Your way of helping an individual is going to be something that I can't tell them. I haven't sat in a 6x6 cell to tell people what that was like and what happened to me. Whereas the individuals that help us as community navigators, many of them have been justice involved. And so they do have that relationship to be able to say, I know what you've been through. I can help you through that because I've been through that process as well. And so some of the organizations we fund as community navigator organizations, they do the same type of work. They're able to provide that basis and that footing and that grounding that individuals need when they're returning from being in the system to coming back to society. So our practice areas that we have, or our areas that we do before the law, those are truly our attorneys, and our attorneys are the ones that, they eventually file a paperwork and they go to court. But our navigators even help with that, because they help people file their paperwork. If you want to say you want to represent yourself, or you want to try and do this on your own, our navigators are able to help fill out that paperwork. Now, we won't tell you what to write on the paperwork, but we can help you read through it. Imagine how many people have gone to prison, unfortunately, 21, 22. And so you may have had just a basic or very little education. And technology has changed so much till you really may not understand the forms. And again, most of the forms now are not where you write on them. Everything has to be done electronically. And so you're confused. How do I fill this form out? What do I put on this form? For someone that's really homeless, and we have a lot of that, what address do I use? Do I use the address from the shelter? Do I use my mom's address? Can I use somebody's address and I'm kind of couch hopping? Where do I have them say, how do they reach me? And our navigators are trained to say, where's the place you spend the most time? Or we say, we're a legal aid agency, and to our knowledge, we're not going anywhere. We can have the form sent to us, so use our address. That gives people a sense of comfort and relief, because guess what? They're not trying to figure out, I'm doing this, but they'll never be able to reach me because I don't really have an address. And the same for phones. We all have cell phones, but if you're a returning citizen, you may not have a cell phone. And if you do have a cell phone, you may not be able to pay the cell phone bill longer than the first month that you have that phone. So then again, we have no way to contact you. So we use our offices as a means to still be a background and a support for individuals to be able to have that as a resource. And so we're doing our best to break barriers to being able to access justice. And one or two of the tables that I was at, we were talking about this. Some of the barriers to justice are the whole income situation. You have to be below a certain income level, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. Our organization does not have that barrier in place. You don't have to be Black, brown, or purple. You don't have to live 200, have 200% below the poverty line. You just have to be a person in need of social services. And then we have a navigator that's there to walk you through that process. We work with the Justice Advisory Council right now, and that council right now is actually a council where we do case management for victims and families that have been affected by gun violence. And so we do case management for them, and we help walk them through what is that process. How do you continue to live life after you've been impacted by gun violence? Yes, ma'am. And then we do Know Your Rights. And the Know Your Rights is really education. And it's education around what are your rights as a person in society right now. What are your renters' rights? What are your rights when you encounter the police? What are your rights just day-to-day activities? In Chicago, we have some of the schools have police in them. What are your rights as a student if you should be thrown on the floor by a police officer? Can you say anything? Who do you call? What do you do? And so we share that information. Sharing information and resources is a huge factor for us to make sure we're educating our population. And then I said this at the beginning, some of our navigators are more impactful than attorneys. And that's because they spend time with the community member. They're responding to the needs of the community member. Many of our community members would be lost without them because they have the support and the guidance of someone that they know they can contact regularly. Your attorney, you can probably contact, leave a message. They'll get back to you in a couple of days. They may talk to you once or twice and they're done. Our navigators are just the opposite. You can call them, they'll return your call. You continue to call them for each issue that you may have, and they're there to help you walk you through that process.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Mendoza. I'm an immigration organizer at the Resurrection Project. A little bit about the Resurrection Project. We're a non-for-profit organization located in Chicago. And we predominantly serve an immigrant community, specifically Mexican community in Chicago. The mission of the Resurrection Project is really to propel people to act on their beliefs and their values, immigration being one of those. So want to talk a little bit about the Immigrant Justice Legal Clinic and our department and kind of what we do. I think there was a slide before. I'm not sure if it got transferred. Okay, we're just gonna wing it, don't worry. So within the Resurrection Project, we have the Immigrant Justice Legal Department. And that's kind of divided into two categories or three buckets. One of them being the Immigrant Justice Legal Clinic, right? So we know when we talk about immigration that attorneys are important. They're super important, right? All of these processes, you have to go to immigration, you have to do all of these things. And so we need to have an attorney who's trained, who knows what they're doing to help with immigration. So we are able to take on deportation cases, citizenship cases, and then a variety of other cases. What we have talked about in our department is the fact that we really do want to focus on immigrants who are already in the US, who are already in Chicago, right? We know that there's a lot of people who are trying to adjust their status and come to the US. We just don't have the capacity to be able to also serve them. So that is really important for us to be able to kind of like focus and hone in on who we're trying to serve. And so it's how do we serve the people who are already here, the immigrants who are already here, and how do we improve their lives is the other part of it. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay, it's a little small, so I apologize for that. I was working with an iPad because my computer was not working. And that goes, hand in hand with my adventure to get here. But basically, when we talk about immigration, we talk about a broken system, right? And I'm not going to go into numbers and things like that as it relates to immigration in the US, but a lot of it has to do with, the time that it takes for applications to be processed, the time that it takes for you to be able to see a judge, the low approval rates for asylum cases, right? The fact that there hasn't been any changes since 1986, right? Like that was the last reform in the US. And so we often talk about it as a broken system, but the more I do this work, the more I actually think the system is working, right? Because this is what the system was designed to do. The system was designed to keep immigrants away, right? To make it complicated. I am one of those immigrants, right? Julie mentioned earlier, I'm a DACA recipient, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So I came to the US when I was 7 years old from Mexico. I've been there 27 years now. My parents are still undocumented. I have a permission to be able to work in the US, but even getting to Canada was a real issue because I can leave, but coming back, we'll see. I have that permission to come back, but we'll see. And so, that's what I think of when I think about this broken system, is like it's actually working. And there's some great things that attorneys can do, but for some people like my parents, they have no relief. So there's nothing an attorney can do, right? They can't apply to anything. There's nothing else I can do. I can't apply to anything else. And so, part of our community navigator model is like, what else, right? How else can we provide support to improve the lives of immigrants in Chicago, in Illinois, and make it better? Okay, so these are the three buckets that the Immigrant Justice Department works on. So talked about the legal clinic. The leadership and advocacy, that's where I work out of, right? And that's really thinking about our community navigator model. So again, right, if you don't have a path, right, there's an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the US. Those 11 million people are not undocumented just because they can't find an attorney, right? They're undocumented because there's no path. And so, the community navigator program is allowing us to provide basic information around your rights, to be able to connect people to an attorney. And I think it's really important for people to talk to an attorney and figure out if they have a path or not, right? To think about kind of like their next steps. How do you think about your long-term planning in the US, right? My parents are at the age, my dad's 61, my mom's 60, about to turn 65. And they're thinking about like, what does retirement look like in the US for them, right? If they're not able to work, if they're not able to have access to the safety nets, like what is there for them? And so that's part of what our community navigator work does. We also do a lot of advocacy around making sure that immigrants are included in the laws and the policy that the state or the city pass. And so we have different campaigns that we participate in. So one of them that I'll mention, which is called Illinois Access to Justice. The work that Charisse talked about, the work that I do, is funded by the state. So we're awarded 25? 20, I was like, I always have to double check those numbers. So $25 million to do this work, to be able to fund other organizations across the state of Illinois to be able to do community navigator work. And that's, money that year after year, we have to go to the state and say like, this is something needed, right? It's also something revolutionary because it is the first time funding is being allocated exclusively, or it was the first time funding was being exclusively allocated for a program that only immigrants had access to, right? We also were very intentional in how we did this partnership and how we went up to the state to ask for this money, right? We knew that something that was going to happen was that we were going to be divided in communities, right? So in the US, when people think about immigration, they tend to look at it from like a Latino, Hispanic, right? Predominantly Mexican perspective, right? Like that's who an immigrant looks like, according to a lot of people. We know that that's not the case, right? That there's immigrants from everywhere who need help. When we talk about the criminal system, people often think about it as an issue of the Black community only, right? And we know that that is not the case. And so, we made the intentional decision to go in and partner with Westside Justice Center to be able to go in and ask for this money, because we knew eventually what was going to happen, right, was that there was going to be that division, that tensions between the community. So we said, no, we're going in together and we're asking for this money together so that we both, right, are able to do this work that is needed. There's also other things like Healthy Illinois and Defenders for All. So Healthy Illinois is the campaign. Illinois was actually the first state to be able to pass health insurance through the state for people, even if they are undocumented, right? And I'm not going to talk about the health care system in the US, but that was something that our undocumented community now has access to because of the work that we've been doing. We do deportation campaigns, right? To just, if you are at the end of the line in the court system, right? The judge has finally said, that's it, you're going to be deported. There's nothing else for you. There's nothing else that can be done at the legal side of it, but there's still a lot of community pressure that could be done, right? And so that's kind of what our community navigators do, is like making sure that we're putting on that community pressure so that whenever somebody goes in front of a judge or enters immigration, we're standing outside with them, making sure that they're gonna come out. And then there's also the other bucket of work that we do, which is the partnership, right? So it's how do we grow and expand our field, right? So the Resurrection Project is one of the along with the West Side Justice, receives the $25 million. We then subgrant that money to different organizations along in the state. And we hold these trainings that Charisse talked about to be able to do capacity, and like growing in the field. We know that we're never gonna have enough attorneys. We know that, right? And so it's like, how do we think creatively about what are some other programs, that can be implemented? So we have community navigators, right, who are able to do a lot of that community work, advocacy, who are able to accompany people. But there's also a DOJ accredited program for people to be able to give legal advice under the supervision of an attorney, and that only exists within the non-for-profit world. And so that's part of like the partnership group is like, how do we think about it in just, how do we think creatively about growing and expanding? Okay, there we go. And then these are just some pictures I'm going to share of some of the work. What do our community navigators look like for the Resurrection Project? A lot of them look like women, right? A lot of them, actually, their median age is around 42. I'm not very good at working with the youth. I call them the youth, right? So I should not be working with them. But for the Resurrection Project, a lot of them are women. A lot of them are they themselves immigrants or come from a mixed status family. And they all do this work because they care about the community, because they want to be part of the community, right? And I think that's one important piece of the program is if you don't have this legal remedy to be able to adjust your status, you still have the ability to have this public life, right? Just because you're an immigrant does not mean that you need to go in the shadows. Like, you have the right to go and talk to your representatives about what is needed. And so you see there some pictures of like some of the actions that we've done. So Families Belong Together was actually a deportation defense. Somebody was going into immigration. There was a potential that they were going to be deported. So we were out there in like the middle of January. So it was like below zero for like 6 hours. During COVID, then we kind of moved, and the program is flexible enough where you can think about like what else is needed. So during COVID, we were doing a lot of things like food distribution, information around the vaccines about COVID. Also our navigators share their story, right? A lot of them are public about being undocumented. I think about my story, and when I was in high school, no one knew that I was undocumented. Absolutely no one knew. It took me years before I told my best friend that I was undocumented. I now do this work, and it's like the first thing that comes out of my mouth, right? It's like, my name's Laura and I'm undocumented. Never in a million years that I think that was going to be the case. But a lot of our navigators share their story. We go, this is actually in Springfield as we were advocating to make sure that Illinois Access to Justice got funding. And then some of our other campaigns, some of our other roles that we do. That's the last picture you see there. You see a lot of red. So it's the parent mentor program, which works very similar to community navigators, community women. And there were about 200 people in this picture that were brought just from our organization. And so, okay, I think I had one more thing, which was just, you know, this has taken years. I've been at the Resurrection Project for about 7 years. And the program started back in 2017 because of then President Trump, right? Chicago, Illinois decided that they were going to be at the forefront and that they were going to be, they were going to not support, right, this anti-immigrant administration that was going to come on board. And so the decision was made that money was going to be invested for attorneys. The Resurrection Project fought back and said, attorneys are not enough, because we know that some people are not going to have a path to adjust. Some people are still going to be deported and they need a multitude of services. So we need community navigators. And so in the past 7 years, right, it's grown from 8 organizations in the city of Chicago and funding only coming from the city of Chicago to how many organizations are we at? 80? 80 organizations throughout the state of Illinois, receiving about $25 million.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sasha Steinberger with LegalLink in the Bay Area. And I am going to tell you about our Community Navigator program. And I think we all start, all the programs up here, start with sort of a similar problem, which I think stitches together whether you want to call it community and informal justice or trusted intermediaries or community navigators or justice workers. We all start from this point of a sort of well-earned lack of trust in the legal system. So in each of our trainings that we do with our community navigators, we start asking, what's one word that describes the legal system to you? These are a few of them. Take a moment. There's a lot of repeats, but unfair and unjust and racist and complicated are maybe some of the most familiar. So it's wonderful to hear about all of the work being done in Chicago and other places. To be fair, there's not that many of us doing this work. So there are not that many programs in the United States, and it's exciting to see everything that's happening here. So at LegalLink, our mission is to remove legal barriers that prolong poverty by adding critically needed capacity to the legal ecosystem. So our eye is on poverty, and accordingly, we do not focus on one specific legal issue. Our navigators, some of them are on the screen. Our navigators are trusted community members, much like the other programs. For us, most of them work at nonprofits. These community members already exist. They're already helping people to and through the system. We just haven't always seen them as part of the legal ecosystem. So in fact, in the Bay Area where we are, there are over 100,000 social service providers. Many of whom are reflective of the communities they serve, and they're already working as first responders to house, employ, and stabilize families. So because our direction is poverty reduction, our ultimate goal, we partner with nonprofits already doing that work, those providing intensive case management to get families housed, employed, and stable. So we now partner with over 50 Bay Area-based nonprofits. And the bulk of our partnerships are social service providers, like some of those on the board. But we've also partnered with organizations in the health and faith-based sectors. And what happens is these partners send their staff through our programs, our training programs. Once trained with us, the providers remain employed with their organizations. They don't become our employees, but they add this new tool to their toolbox. They then have access to our website, they receive our newsletters, they can contact us for consults on any legal issue. And this added skill set helps clients access legal protections and helps the provider with their own end goals of housing and stabilizing and employing families. To date, we've trained over 1,300 community partners in legal first aid, and we've delivered more than 4,000 legal consults to navigators and their clients. So our model is a little bit different from some of the others you've heard. While many of us are attorneys, we don't actually represent clients ourselves. Ours is a wholly community navigator-based organization. And we run 2 main programs, our legal first aid training program and our community navigator fellowship program. In legal first aid, it's sort of our intro training. We train folks to identify and surface and triage, respond to legal issues. We use frameworks for each area of law. We think the law can actually be simplified. It doesn't actually have to be so complicated. And we present a methodology that folks can use to walk through legal issues, any legal issue that comes up, so that folks don't freeze. Many of us freeze when we don't know the answer or it's outside of our expertise. And then we pair the training with online tools and after supports. Our fellowship program is a more intensive program that helps with a smaller group of staff, similarly at our partner organizations. We also cultivate sort of our broader network of navigators, that 1,300 plus, and lots of continued engagement and multiple touch points along the way. We also have resources and advocacy on our list. Resources, of course, we have this website we've built that has some tools on it for our navigators to use. They need to have resources when they go back to their community organizations. We also often fill holes. So when legal providers have not already created, we like to use what's already out there. We don't want to duplicate, but when there isn't a resource or an FAQ or guidelines, we produce those as well. We also on advocacy work with folks on both sides, legal and social service, to help fill the holes and to note the holes when there are often laws on the books that folks on the ground are not experiencing the benefits of. We also share about our programming as much as we can and encourage folks to consider community navigator programs in their work. So how do we know that our work is moving the needle? These are some of our recent fellows, and we have amazing feedback from them, right? We collect a lot of stories and a lot about client wins. But for those of us who like data and some numbers, we also wanted a program management system that helped us track this work. We tied our work to an existing metric, of which there are not that many in this space. But as some may be familiar with Pleasance and Ballmer's work around legal capability, that grounds our data. Legal capability is an emerging or maybe more established concept now that generally refers to the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to deal effectively with the law. That includes mobilization to resolve legal problems, obtain relevant advice, and achieve better outcomes. So since 2020, when we started using this metric, we found first in our legal first aid programs, that's our sort of lighter touch program. Overall, 95% of trained navigators report an increase in legal capability from pre to post training, 95%. Also, 74 to 84% of them report increases in each of the key questions, knowing how to identify legal issues, knowing how to connect clients to resources, and what support they personally can provide. And that's a one-day program. And so we think it is possible. It's very hard for folks to learn how to issue spots. Sometimes the law is complicated, and we also think it is very possible to figure out how to make it more simple and to teach it. Next, in our fellows program, where we track more depth around case outcomes, we found that 99% of the navigators' legal navigation cases had a successful outcome. 99%. That was 16% legal wins and 33% non-legal wins. About half were neutral wins. 78% of those were unresolved at the end of program. So that's usually family and immigration cases, which last longer than the length of the program. And we had just one legal loss of all of them. 82% of the cases had a positive impact on the client's economic, family, or housing stability. So what have we learned from all of this? We've been excited to learn from the data and then to share our learnings with other states that want to replicate the model. We've recently worked with Oklahoma and South Carolina to stand up programs there and translated our legal first aid curriculum to those states. It turns out that those, if you bubble it up and make those legal frameworks simple and understandable, they also translate to other jurisdictions. And what we've learned is for all states is that it works. Legal capability goes up. 2/3 of people trained are using this material with clients post-training, and the net promoter scores, would you recommend this to a colleague, are really off the charts in terms of where they stand against the legal field and beyond. We've also learned that it works in rural or urban areas, and in fact, in some ways, it is in more demand in rural areas where there are fewer resources. And we have learned now too how to help folks build and scale a program. So what's next for us? A few highlights. One is that we are pivoting our fellows program from a multi-issue program. Most of our programs are holistic by design because that's how clients experience legal issues. But we are going to pivot it from a multi-issue program to a single subject issue resolution program, a little bit more like the other ones we've heard about, and like Alaska's Community Justice Worker Program, which some of you may be familiar with. And we're going to first be focusing on consumer debt cases, training folks to actually help to resolve those issues with specific training and attorney support and supervision. We'll be continuing our legal first aid programs in California and expanding their reach throughout the state using an asynchronous learning platform. We are continuing to foster our local network of 1,300 plus navigators and growing it, and our other local Bay Area programming. And we're also continuing to support other jurisdictions to establish and grow their own community navigator programs. So I think my short story is that there's so much exciting work to be done in this field. There's a lot of attention and excitement around this now, and we hope that you'll all join us in the community navigator space.
Good. Hi, everyone. Julie already kindly introduced us all, but I'll just say quickly, my name is Charmel Queen. I'm an associate professor at Warwick School of Law, which is in Coventry in the United Kingdom. And I'm here to talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing collaboratively with a local law center and a national organization called Law for Life in the UK that some of you might know, which has been focused on, sort of qualitative, for specific reasons, legal needs study in Coventry. So kind of the idea behind it was in part some of the stuff about sort of anchor institutions and trying to make sure that as a university and as a law school, we're actually like doing something useful and not just navel gazing and talking to ourselves. And in addition to sort of clinics, we thought, research is also a really important way to do that. And there's some, I think, degree of frustration with kind of large scale quantitative legal needs studies, because they're really important, but they kind of just say the same thing that we know, which is that legal need is vast. It's really difficult to meet it, and there are many barriers to accessing justice, and that if you really want to be able to work with and support marginalized groups to access justice, you need to know about what's happening locally and what people's experiences are. So kind of adding to all of that, we wanted to work with our law center to be able to tell a story about what's happening locally. And with that, we wanted to focus on the role of trusted intermediaries. And this is in part because of what's been happening in the UK in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, which is extreme austerity and basically the decimation of civil legal aid. Something like half of law centers have had to close. Legal aid budgets are down by hundreds of millions, and there's underspends on top of that because there aren't enough providers and people aren't actually getting to what support is available. And so for organizations like the one that we're working with, which is the Central England Law Center, they have weathered all of this incredibly well, but in part by switching to moving, so they still do their kind of core activity of traditional advice and representation, but they've had to think a lot more about what community outreach looks like, what project-based work looks like, what public legal education looks like for them. And so they're sort of pioneering this kind of rights and community strategy that we really wanted to be able to support. And for them, that also means kind of reaching out to local organizations and working more in partnership. So both as a necessity and a kind of innovation in crisis, but also I think as part of a recognition, and as others have already said, that legal aid was never enough, even when there was more of it. And that, that individualized form of service only takes you so far and was never going to be enough to meet the vast legal need that's out there. In addition, we're just looking at the current kind of context that we're in, and obviously the pandemic is a huge part of that and how that shaped the way in which people are accessing justice and kind of made a process of digitization that was already happening really quickly even faster and provided some opportunities, but also created a lot of challenges. And then also, I don't know how it's being referred to here or in the US, but sort of cost of living crisis, where basically, the cost of everything from fuel to food, et cetera, has just gone through the roof and has actually been, for the kind of most affected households, has been even worse than the pandemic was in terms of impact on kind of household budgets and driving people further into poverty. So that's all formed the kind of backdrop for what we're doing. And I should say, so the study itself has involved interviews with people from, broadly speaking, sort of marginalized groups, and intermediaries, in particular, 7 local intermediary organizations have been really key. And they're all sort of non-legal organizations that are already very well established in the community and have some other form of relationship or service that they provide. So 2 are focused around food. So one is the main food bank in the city. Another's a sort of social supermarket, which is kind of like a food bank, but sort of membership based and people pay something. Advocacy and education organizations that work with women who are specifically at risk of or subject to sexual exploitation, as well as sort of marginalized women generally. Supported temporary accommodation for homeless youth, a charity supporting people with mental health issues into employment, and a charity that effectively sort of supports destitute migrants. So those are our intermediaries, and the study is involved interviewing them about the issues that they see, and then having them select for us a sort of a handful of individuals who kind of represent and have lived the kinds of things that they're talking about, so have struggled to deal with law-related issues in the last, well, basically since the start of the pandemic. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of the really key things, and I'm going to be pretty brief, that have come out that I'm trying to reflect on about kind of what intermediaries are and what their role is and what we should do with that. So yeah, I'll run through that. And yeah, a little bit more, I suppose, in a kind of conceptual sense and what the research is trying to make me think about. You know, is this question kind of what is the role of the intermediary? And I think, and hopefully others here would agree, that there's actually something quite radical in the role of the intermediary insofar as, you know, legal knowledge and access to legal knowledge is something that is intensely hierarchical. You know, you have to spend many, many years going to law school and becoming professionally qualified in order to be allowed to practice law and to do something that, you know, really should be everyone's kind of democratic right to be able to know and access and talk about and participate in law and rights in various ways. And so I think, you know, intermediaries are kind of a necessary and already always happening kind of aspect of how people access justice. It's never just been lawyers. But at the same time, they also kind of help to break down some of those hierarchies in a way that I think is kind of destabilizing in a good way. And that the role of the trusted intermediary really comes down to this question of how we distribute legal knowledge in society. And so just some really key aspects of that, again, that others have already mentioned. I think really, really key to that relationship is trust, and in particular, trust that's kind of outside of the legal system. And it's really important, I think, that the state isn't terribly involved in intermediaries and what they're doing, or even lawyers for that matter, because often that's where that trust starts to break down. And so the idea is that people turn to those they trust in order to access, well, with anything that might be happening in their lives, and that's a really important moment to let people know about rights that they might have. And importantly, relationships that already exist, at least for the purposes of our study. It's not a kind of particular program that's being created, it's looking at where people already go. And then when we think about the role, obviously it can be a lot of different things. And again, we've heard a lot of different kinds of terms for describing it, and it's sort of all those things, right? So navigation, translation, I think, and not just in the sense of language, although that's obviously very important, but translating between this very foreign, alienating legal system and the way that the rest of us talk and do and go about our lives and that sort of thing. So moving between the kind of lived reality of something happening and this system that we have to navigate sometimes in order to get what we're entitled to or that's imposed on us. And solidarity, I think, as people are going through that process of being someone that can be leaned on as that's happening. In a really practical sense, it obviously takes on a lot of different forms, and the organizations that we're working with all do it in very different ways. So, you know, in the simplest sense, it's just signposting, although kind of encouraging people to do a little bit more than just signpost, all the way to kind of advocating for someone, contacting government agencies on their behalf, working on benefits applications with them and having that kind of really intense involvement. And then some things in between, like simply providing a social space where people can meet others who might be experiencing similar issues. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And that it really depends, and this is what's really crucial for our study and the kind of intervention that we're thinking about or how to support intermediaries that's coming out of this project, is that this variation is very much about different levels of capacity, how much space is there within their existing work to do this, and then, you know, what sort of skills do they have, how much do they feel able to do, how much do they feel confident to do in that. So at the food bank, for example, the relationship is really fleeting. You know, someone comes in for a parcel and they go, but it's a really important moment where someone could potentially be signposted to other services or kind of helped along the way. But what they can do with that space is going to be very different from, say, an advocacy organization who's kind of set up to help more with those kinds of issues. And then what's the nature of that support? Like, what is the help that they're actually giving? So we can talk about that in a practical sense in terms of the activities, but I've also been trying to think about, so, you know, again, I guess more conceptually, what is it that they're providing? And Sasha's already talked a little bit about legal capability, and I think that's a really big part of it, but it's kind of prompted me to think about legal capability in a slightly different way in that, and I think one of the big critiques of legal capability and why not everyone has sort of adopted it is going to be really individualizing of like, you know, you have the skills and knowledge to deal with your problem, whatever that might be. But I think the intermediaries and how they're involved with people really kind of shows that capability is something collective. And I think the question of confidence is actually one of the things that's really stood out to me from the research, is that having the confidence to be able to challenge the government, to, you know, claim more benefits, to do whatever it is you need to do, is really about having the opportunity to see it work for other people. So one of the participants in our study, for example, had been living on £10 a week and was really scared to kind of challenge the decision that had been made about his benefits because he'd been accused of fraud in the past. And one of the essential things that the intermediary organization had been doing was simply talking to him about it over a period of about 6 months until he finally felt confident enough to say, actually, all right, I'll go see an advisor and I'll go find so that, you know, talk to the legal expert that you've been saying I should talk to. And that's not something that happens overnight. And that's something that's a function of like creating the space and time for that to happen. And, you know, just shows that those things are really relational, that it's really important to have those relationships that can allow someone to develop confidence. And along with that, you know, I mean, some of the other kinds of things that we might talk about with intermediaries, like just recognizing that rights might be relevant in a particular situation, and actually finding where expert help is, because that can be really difficult, obviously. And then I also included there overcoming barriers. And I mean, in that sense, sort of really practical barriers. So, and again, we've heard about some of these things. So, you know, a number of the participants in our study regularly pawn their mobile phone because they need the money. And so it's really difficult for them to contact services. It's really difficult for them to be reached. And so an intermediary providing that kind of support is really essential. It's also barriers like, you know, and I've been trying to sort of differentiate between these things where you have a kind of justiciable issue. I don't know, you want to appeal a benefits decision, just as an example, but the things that get in the way of that and that make that so much more complicated to deal with than just filing an appeal. And I'm sure we could list many, many things, but I think a lot about how, and in the UK, the Department for Work and Pensions has a kind of particular reputation for being unpleasant and giving people wrong information, making them feel small, making them feel like they don't deserve it. So these things that are kind of set up as barriers and deterrents. And one of the really important things that the intermediaries in our study do is kind of help people through that, help them to expect that it's going to be really unpleasant and to not put too much stock in it and to kind of be there with them as that's happening. And that's a really crucial thing in addition to the more practical things. And then for us as well, there's a lot of tensions around this role, as I'm sure there are in other places. So I think these organizations feel a lot of pressure to fill a gap because there isn't anyone to provide these kinds of services. Law centers can only do so much. The funding has been decimated across the board. And I think one of their responses to that is, we don't want to do this work at all. If we wanted to be lawyers, we would be lawyers. That's not what we do. And so even, I think, with best intentions of everyone around and, you know, the law center's desire for more people to be able to access justice, they get a lot of pushback, you know, from other organizations in the community saying, no, we don't want to do people's benefits applications. That's not what we're here for. And then associated with that is there's no resource for it. It's not actually recognized as a role. And it's difficult for them to fit it into other kinds of funding bids that they might do. At the same time, I think it's interesting to come back to the fact that even whether they're being asked to do it or not in a formal sense, or whether it's formally recognized or not, their role is absolutely central because it is where people are going. So the kind of counter pressure is that it's really important that they get it right. Because in a sense, if someone at a food bank tells you, oh, there's nothing you can do about that, then that's what someone will believe. And so it's really important, even if they don't want to take on that role formally, that what they do, they do well. So those are just some of the tensions that we're trying to navigate through. And that we're trying to think about as we design a sort of program to sort of meet all of these different kinds of needs and ways of working across the city. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. So we started late. So Jess, Hannah, can I go a few minutes late on this one, please? Okay, good. Okay, so what I think we'll do, just because the time that remains, is just I'll ask you a couple questions just for any thoughts you might have, just to kind of have a little bit of a conversation here, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. And then I promise you'll get a break before the next session. So just so you know. Okay, so, and I think Laura, you touched on this, but one of the things we talked about in our planning calls was the fact that for many people who are marginalized, the law doesn't provide any solution to their problem, to their legal problem, or if it does provide a solution, it's a really unfair, unjust, unsustainable one. How does your program deal with that? Any thoughts, Sharice, Laura? I know you, or I think Ara, go ahead.
I can go ahead. So I think, Tara kind of like summarized it beautifully, right? When she's talking about like creating community, right? I think like that's such an important key. Some of our community navigators will go through, kind of like the spectrum of like becoming a community navigator to then, becoming more engaged, and maybe they start working in our offices, or maybe they, look to become a DOJ accredited representative, right? So there's kind of like a path for them in the professional sense. But for the majority of our navigators, it really is just about community, right? They have a group of women, of people they can call, they can ask questions to, they're connected to the organization, and that helps them feel just significantly better, right? For most of them, sometimes it's like they don't leave their neighborhood, right? And through the program, through what we do, right, they get to say like, I've gone to Springfield, I went to the Capitol, and I talked to my elected official. And that is very, very important for them. And so I think like that's one of the things that we're able to offer, even though they might not have a path to anything else, even though, what's there for them is not just, they are part of the community, and they are working towards helping us define what is just and helping us work towards justice.
Some hope.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, just to say I would completely agree with that. And I think one of the really important things about intermediaries and having that community is that, the law does not have the answers to quite a lot of different sorts of problems. And the answers it does provide are often insufficient or unsatisfactory. And so we need other kinds of solutions. And that can be something participatory that involves legal organizations. And also, I guess, goes to both ways in the sense that it's helpful, I think, for legal organizations to hear about things that they could work on in terms of reform or more strategic litigation, to hear about kind of problems that are recurring that can't be resolved individually. But yeah, that it comes back to a political question and requires community organizing. And you want to have that community set up to be able to do that.
I just want to add quickly. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I just want to add quickly that I also think sometimes getting a no is helpful. Knowing that you have done what you can do and there isn't a path actually frees you up to go do other stuff, knows that you don't need to keep calling different legal aids. We see this a lot, people bouncing around and no one will tell them what they, if they have a case or if they're talking to the right people. And so I think that's actually part of it.
I'll piggyback off of that. In Illinois, if you have to sign up one of the 4 registries, sexual abuse, as a sex offender, as arson, murder registries, then there's not a recourse for you to get your record sealed or expunged. There is, however, recourse in that we can let you know right up front. Although the government will not allow you to erase those records from your life, we have community organizations that can still help you enter into the community again, into a safe environment and a space that's not just safe for you, but a space that's safe for the community in which you need to be involved in, irregardless of what your background was.
Thank you. Okay, so on a sort of kind of a related note, in Ontario, many of us continue to call for more robust funding and more robust support for legal aid services. And supporting the efforts of trusted intermediaries can sometimes be seen as detracting from, from that push, from the sort of making that call for better legal aid. What are your thoughts on that?
For us, it's been just the opposite. We advocate every year for funding for Illinois access to justice, and we don't just advocate for the Resurrection Project in the West Side Justice Center. The very first year we did this program, I think we had 50 organizations. This is year four for us, and now we're up to 80 organizations. And so every year around February, March, we take all of our organizations, all of any clients that want to go and share their stories to Springfield, and we advocate for our funding. And so we spend time with our legislative officials saying, this is why this funding is so important. We gather the data for their zip codes to show this is where help is still needed. These are the people in your area that this is affecting. And so if you all decrease our funding, here's what we're no longer able to do. And so we make sure that we take individuals with us. We take the organizations with us. And like I said, we start in February. They don't pass our budget until the end of May, but during that entire time, we are talking, we are writing letters, we are calling to make sure that our funding is never cut. And we've been blessed in that it's never been cut. It has always been increased. But that's to the point of making sure that all of the organizations and the people that we support are out there advocating for the work that we do because we know it's needed.
I would add too that I think even if funding stays exactly the same, imagine if you are a legal aid that community navigators or justice workers are a way to extend your work. Alaska Community Legal Services is our big federal LSC funded legal aid in Alaska. They have one attorney supervising 300 community justice workers who are taking on cases under their supervision because they've been trained up to do discrete pieces of the work that are not complicated and they have a lot of methods in place to make sure that there's supervision and all of that. But imagine it as a way to extend your work, not as something that detracts from it.
I would only just add briefly, it's a kind of key site of tension for us at the moment, in part because of the recent cuts and the potential for intermediaries to be seen as a kind of cheaper alternatives. I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that having kind of effective intermediaries and better outreach into the community increases the demand for legal aid. So like when you do early intervention or whatever you want to call it, it's not generally completely resolving a problem early. It's actually getting someone to seek the justice that they're entitled to. And so, I don't see them as mutually exclusive, and that it's really important just to not see that one-to-one traditional advice and representation mode as the only or kind of most effective mode of having access to justice.
I mean, just that it takes a lot of work really to have people have that buy-in and that understanding of whatever it is that you're going to call your program, right? Whether it's community navigators, mediators, wherever it might be. We still definitely get pushback from attorneys, and I like to say we're pretty well established at this point, 7 years in, and elected officials know the work that we do. But that continues to be an issue for us. And, we've been very intentional about having that education piece with elected officials, right? Like if we go to them and we talk about community navigators, like they know what that model means now. And I think that's really, really important that it goes hand in hand. And as you're advocating for yourself in legal aid and attorneys, you're also advocating for this community piece to be able to enhance your work.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to take 1 minute to ask Pilar if she's still there. Pilar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, what is your biggest hope for how the report launched on Monday, how that report will be used in this area to support the kind of work that we heard about today or in other ways?
So I think the report tries to reflect precisely many of the experiences and many of the challenges that these examples and these community services have been presenting to us today, giving visibility to the real struggles that people encounter in order to be able to resolve their justice needs and do so in as fair as possible conditions against really formidable odds. Inequality is worse than ever, and that's really affecting the quality of treatment that people are going to be able to get, including because they can't just limit things to the community level. As many of you have explained, these are justice problems that are often interconnected to a higher level or other levels of the bureaucracy, the state administration, whatever it is. So these inequalities, which are getting worse globally, including in the UK and the US, are a huge challenge. It means that in thinking in this plural way and about the need the experiences that we're describing here, there is a very important political demand to ensure that resourcing gets to these kinds of experiences and these programs, because this is what makes a difference, not only to the very particular individual capacity to resolve justice needs, but to our experience as citizens. And without that, the quality of democratic governance and democratic citizenship is just going to get worse. So while the Customary Informal Justice Report, in many of the minds of global North policymakers, speaks to what we can do for faraway countries in the global South, the fact is that the challenges are real in the so-called established democracies of the global North. And without that, we are encountering a real deterioration of the capacity to provide fair, not only access to justice, but fair access to justice and fair access to mechanisms to resolve legal needs in all their diversity. So I think it's important to take ownership of this international agenda, because it speaks to the issues that have been discussed today very eloquently.
Thank you, Pilar. Ownership. I like that. Collective ownership. Okay. So I apologize for not having more time for this part of it, but the panelists will now take questions from the audience. So if you can just go up to the microphone, and we'll take about another, 7 or 8 minutes to do that.
This is why you sit beside the microphone. Okay, I didn't introduce myself earlier. Leslie McCullough from the Workplace Sexual Harassment Legal Clinic in the Yukon. We do act as we give legal advice. We act as a firm of lawyers, basically, although under our funding, we are restricted in terms of representation. So my question is, Laura, you just adverted to it. Charisse, you spoke earlier about we give legal information, of course, but not legal advice. But we know, and we've heard, that people who are working in the field, the ALS example is really good. And I've spoken to them in the past. They know what they're doing a lot of the time, and they may know, like somebody who has worked in the area knows a lot more than somebody who is pretty junior coming to that area, somebody who's done wills for years and then says, okay, yeah, I'll help you with your immigration matter. So there is still resistance from some lawyers, the law societies, protection of the public. Yes, I acknowledge that has to be done, but I'm wondering two things, like on an international level, what have you done, or has anything been successful in getting that buy-in from people? Because often people self-police. I can't do that. That's legal advice. Like really, when they are capable of doing it and they are the trusted community member, they would be good, but they're worried. I can't go over that line. But really, how often does that happen? Like, is this a bit of a chimera, a false worry? But it is certainly something that the credentialism that is built into the formal law society is really something that is wielded again in a way that is really detrimental to providing further access to justice. So I'm interested to know what you have seen that is helpful.
So for us, we pair our attorneys and our community navigators together. And so part of our program are what we call legal aid agencies, and part of them are community navigator agencies. And often we get together, I should say once a quarter we get together, and we bring all together, our legal aid agencies and our community navigators, so that our navigators are trained by attorneys on what to say and what not to say. And if they get into that sticky situation of teetering on trying to give legal advice, they have an out. And so they're able to say, I am not a trained attorney to give you legal advice. However, here's what I can share with you. There are some times where may have an attorney and a community navigator talking to a client together. So then if a community navigator should say something, an attorney is present. And so then they're not practicing on the unauthorized practice of law. And so this still helps our community member, but keeps our community navigators from being accused of practicing law, and they're not allowed to do so.
I'll just add, I think one of the biggest tools that we are able to give our community navigators is that ability to connect somebody to resources, right? So through the Illinois Access to Justice Fund, everybody in the state of Illinois is able to receive free legal consultation as it relates to immigration. And then like, that's a huge tool, right? Because when you get to that point of like, this might be like on the verge of legal advice, you know, one of the things we didn't want was for community navigators to be like, well, this is legal advice. I can't really tell you, even though I know what, you know, is going to be, and then just kind of leave the community member hanging, right? So they're able to make that connection to an attorney. And it's not perfect, right? Like we suffer from the same things of like not having enough attorneys, right? Like people having to wait to be able to talk to an attorney, but that community navigator there is there to advocate, right? Like they will call me and they'd be like, nobody has called them, right? And I'll be like, Cherise, nobody has called them, right? So like, get on it. So they have that ability not only to connect to that resource, but to follow through and to make sure that people are talking to our attorneys. And so I think like that's a huge tool that we give them.
You know, I think, you know, in some of the states in the US, we have regulatory reform happening, right? UPL reform, authorized practice of law. In Alaska, there's a waiver. In Arizona, there's a waiver. In Utah, there's a sandbox. In Delaware, there's a waiver. Texas is considering. Montana is considering. This is where things are going. And so information versus advice is a super complicated line. I don't think most attorneys necessarily, we're teaching a law school course right now on this. I would say the law students are much worse at it than the community navigators we work with. In general, because we're in California, there is no waiver, there is no sandbox. And I'm a former litigator, we train very carefully around UPL so people know what they can and can't say. A couple of things. We found that people don't want to give advice that they don't know. So they're not inclined to, and it helps them get off the hook to say, you know what, now I know that's my role. I can't say that, or this is where I need to hand off. And I would say that if we're not training, people are guessing. If we're not engaging and helping to clarify some of those lines, then people are guessing. And I'm sure it gets crossed. It gets crossed all the time. It gets crossed with lots of lawyers knowing all the time in different settings, and some things we decide to care about and some things we decide to not care about. So a lot of work to be done.
Yep. Okay, other questions, and then we'll maybe take a break for coffee. Any other questions, or are you too anxious for your break? And there's also the workshop that follows this, but good, another question.
Hi, I'm Sukhpreet Sangha from LEAF. I have a question that relates to the previous question a bit. I'm curious about how folks are navigating the tension between sort of the professionalization of folks in this role that can work to remove them from community where there's a really meaningful role for them to play. So I'm talking about, you know, like the nonprofit industrialization complex, and there's this tension, right? People need this community navigator role. It occupies a different space in the framework than lawyers do. But if people go down a career path of credentialization with this, then it removes community knowledge in a way that's actually detrimental. So I sense from everyone's comments that you're aware of this and you're thinking about this. And so I'd like to hear more about that and how you try to work against that while at the same time getting funding for these roles in a more professional context. We heard a bit about that, but I would love for folks to expand if you could.
We were just actually talking about this before. And I don't think I have a good answer to that question, except that I think it's a really important concern. And I think there is a real risk of over professionalizing it and becomes another barrier or another rung that you have to go through to try to access justice, and that you lose that kind of trusted embeddedness within people's communities. That's so essential, I think, to what we're talking about. And I honestly don't don't know. And I think there has to be other ways of funding it that aren't about making it a discrete role. But I think there's also some real advantages, as you know, these programs show, to having it as a discrete role. But I think being quite careful about what that role is and where it goes and where that person's located. So I don't think it's an either or, but just something to be really mindful of, which is not a very satisfactory answer to your question, but yeah.
You know, we have pushed pretty hard back against pulling folks out of their organizations. So everyone we work with stays embedded. The idea is that knowledge stays embedded in the organizations. You get sort of not a license, a accreditation a bit for going through the program, but that only means that folks know that you've done it. It doesn't keep anyone else from doing it, and you stay at your organization. You also might go to a new organization and take the knowledge with you. The whole goal of it, I mean, in some ways it would be easier because we would have more capacity if we could hire our own navigators, but then they're not embedded in the community. So that's been our way of approaching it, has been to only work with folks who are community embedded.
And I'll add, I think, one of the things is we look at our community navigator program as a leadership program, right? So it's like not necessarily how are you moving along, getting credentials, but how are you moving along like this leadership model? And, if eventually you do end up having a more robust role, it's like, who else are you training, right? I know we'll talk maybe more about like, what does the program look like? But for me, right, I have 6 what we call super navigators, right? So they're a lot more embedded in our program, in what we do every day, day to day. And then they each have a group of about 10 women that they oversee that are community navigators, right? And so, as we're moving people along, we're constantly also bringing people on and kind of moving them along that leadership spectrum.
And I think the last thing I'll add, touching off of Tara's point, is that we truly try to involve individuals that are part of the community. And so they've been just as impacted. And so they can relate to other people in the community versus someone that doesn't know the system at all and they have no relation to it. Because people that have already been impacted have a louder voice and a better sense of what someone else is going through because they've been through it as well. And so, not saying we don't want others outside of the community to help, but that prevents people from doing the credentialing because you're not necessarily part of the community that these other individuals are part of.
Yeah, Pilar, I did forget about you, but then I remembered anything like that you'd like to add in response to the last couple of questions, and then I need to send you off for coffee. But Pilar, anything else you'd like to add?
Just very quickly, to really agree with this idea of embedding the knowledge in the community and investing in legal voice and agency, not only in the organizations themselves, but in the community itself, with the end users. And I think that's fundamental for the kind of work that these organizations are doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Pilar, for participating in this and presenting today in such a busy week for you with the launch of the report. And as I said, we'll make sure all the participants at the conference get the link. And thank you so much to our 4 panelists. I've been so delighted to have lots of fun conversations with them in the last little while. And we really appreciate you traveling here and putting the time into sharing your wisdom and experience at your organizations. These 4 panelists in person will be one of the workshops that will follow, which I think will start at 10 to 3. So you got a 10-minute break now. Sorry that you don't have 15 minutes, but really. So thank you. And have your coffee and break, and then we'll see you at at the workshops.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Sorry I screwed up on your slide. It was nice. I don't know what I did. I spent a while. I was waiting for my You can't do it all the time. You're the only one I gave the 1 minute to because I didn't know how to.